I feel as if, in the one sense, we're inundated with data bits about ISIS in this country. If you think about column inches in the newspaper or minutes on the broadcast media and so on, it's not that we don't hear the name, it's not that we don't see the images, but we don't really have an interpretation of it that makes sense. And I feel, I myself have tried to learn more, and I've tried to or have read a couple books from people that I would say are, national security consultants. And my sense is that there's a culture that goes along with being a national security consultant, that, they have a lot of information, but maybe they don't put things in context the same way you or I might. You think that's fair, or have you looked at their
Well,
work?
I think that there is a culture, and I think part of it is it's grounded in the assumption that military force is the option, and we either use it or we do nothing. It's kind of the message that we heard from George W. Bush on the day after the 9/11 attacks, where he said, we face this choice. We either go to war or we let them get away with it. It's war or nothing. It's never war or nothing. I think that what we're seeing is a real failure to look at two major issues. One is, what was the origin of ISIS? Clue, it wasn't about Obama pulling the troops out of Iraq. And two, what are the options to dealing with ISIS beyond military? So if we look at the first one, it's very easy to answer. What's the origin of ISIS? The origin of ISIS is in 2004, George Bush is president, and ISIS, or what was then called something else, but the same organization that eventually morphed into ISIS, was one of many Sunni-led, Sunni-dominated militias in Iraq fighting against U.S. occupation and against the government the U.S. had installed, a sectarian Shia government. That's the origin of ISIS.
So,
Sorry,
so
go ahead.
and just for listeners who don't know, obviously, in the Middle East, you have certain sectarian divisions between Sunni and Shia Muslims, although I think those have been inflamed by our invasion there, if my understanding is correct. But you have this division. You had the Sunni minority essentially running the government, and correct me at any point if I'm wrong, running the government under Saddam Hussein. We overthrew Saddam Hussein. A Shia government took over, and perhaps mistreated the Sunni minority, and this, in effect, was the end result. Fair summary, you think?
Fair. The only thing I would add is that even before the sectarian aspect of it took hold, which was fairly early, there was this anti-occupation part of it. The origins of ISIS are specifically grounded in opposition to the US occupation. It started in 2004 when the occupation was only about a year old. And it was one of many. It was one of many organizations, both Sunni and Shia, that were fighting against the occupation. But it was in that context, exactly as you say, that sectarianism began to rise, because even though Sunnis had been privileged during the years of Saddam Hussein's government, they had more higher positions, disproportionate power in the military in particular. It wasn't as if the government, which was a ruthlessly secular government, it wasn't trying to impose some kind of Sunni legislation or something. It was privileging a certain community, and it was through religion that that community was identified. What happened when the US imposed Shia-dominated government took power was that the repression of Sunnis, because they were Sunnis, became incredibly strong. So after a period, including the period of the so-called Sunni awakening, when the US decided it would be a good move to just pay off Sunni militias to fight on the US side instead of against the US, that lasted for a couple of years until the US decided, you know what, we're kind of done paying this. This is now going to be the responsibility of this government, this Shia-dominated government we've put in power. They're now going to pay these Sunni fighters to not fight against the government. And guess what? The Shia-dominated government decided, we don't really want to pay these guys. We're just going to stop paying them. So the opposition forces took hold again. And it was in that context that you saw a really powerful rise of the sectarianism that led to the sectarian civil war in Syria that was so strong in the period around 2007, 2008. And then it sort of faded away again. The ISIS group faded from sight. They didn't disappear, but they became much less overt in their actions, and suddenly they kind of reappeared around 2011 in Syria, having jumped over the border into Syria, and now they were operating in Syria. And they were far more sectarian and far more religiously defined than they ever had been before.